At 10:22 hours on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey rolled his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber into a 70-degree dive from 14,500 feet. Through his bomb sight, he watched the Japanese aircraft carrier Kaga grow larger, her flight deck packed with armed and fueled aircraft. Around him, 36 more Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise followed him down. 3 miles to the east, 17 Dauntless bombers from USS Yorktown were beginning their own dives on the carrier Soryu. In 6 minutes, between 10:22 and 10:28 hours, these 54 American dive bombers would mortally wound 3 Japanese fleet carriers. In 6 minutes, they would destroy the most powerful carrier striking force ever assembled. In 6 minutes, they would shift the strategic balance of the entire Pacific War, and they would accomplish this not through overwhelming numbers or superior technology, but because they arrived at the single moment when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, when their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, when their combat air patrol fighters were at sea level chasing torpedo bombers, when their damage control preparations had been disrupted by constant alerts and rapid changes in armament. Those 6 minutes at Midway were not predetermined. They resulted from a series of decisions, mistakes, coincidences, and desperate sacrifices that brought American dive bombers to the right place at the right time. Understanding what happened in those 6 minutes requires understanding everything that led to that moment and everything that made the Japanese carriers vulnerable when the American bombs began to fall. The road to Midway began 6 months earlier on December 7, 1941, when Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier striking force attacked Pearl Harbor. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zukaku, launched 353 aircraft that destroyed or damaged 8 American battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 188 aircraft. The attack killed 403 Americans and crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The Pearl Harbor attack was brilliantly executed, but strategically incomplete. The American aircraft carriers were at sea and escaped damage. The oil storage facilities, dry docks, and repair facilities at Pearl Harbor remained intact. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise and inflicted devastating losses, but they had not eliminated American ability to project naval power across the Pacific. Over the following 5 months, Nagumo's carriers dominated the Pacific. They supported the invasion of the Dutch East Indies, attacked British forces off Ceylon, covered Japanese landings across Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific. Japanese naval aviators were the most experienced and best trained in the world. Their aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, were superior to most Allied fighters in speed, maneuverability, and range. Japanese carrier doctrine, developed over 2 decades, emphasized coordinated mass strikes that overwhelmed enemy defenses. By May 1942, Japanese strategic planners believed the time had come to eliminate the remaining American carrier threat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, proposed Operation MI, the invasion of Midway Atoll. Midway was a small American outpost, 300 miles northwest of Hawaii, strategically positioned to threaten Japanese operations. More importantly, capturing Midway would force the American carriers into a decisive battle where Japanese numerical superiority would destroy them. Yamamoto assembled the largest naval force Japan had ever sent to sea. The plan involved multiple forces approaching from different directions, diversionary attacks in the Aleutian Islands, and intricate timing. The carrier striking force under Nagumo would attack Midway on June 4th, destroy the airfield and defenses, then prepare for the inevitable American counterattack. When American carriers arrived, Japanese fighters would destroy them. The invasion force would then land troops and occupy Midway. American naval power in the Pacific would be eliminated. What Yamamoto did not know was that American cryptanalysts had broken Japanese naval codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, knew about the Midway operation weeks in advance. He knew the Japanese order of battle, the attack date, and the planned approach routes. Nimitz positioned his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush. The American force was outnumbered. Nagumo's carrier striking force included 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These ships carried 248 aircraft, mostly Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, and Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. Supporting the carriers were 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers. Additional Japanese forces, including battleships, cruisers, and 2 light carriers, operated in other areas, but were too far away to support Nagumo during the critical battle. Against this force, Nimitz had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. These ships carried 233 aircraft, mostly Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters. The American carriers were supported by 8 cruisers and 15 destroyers. On paper, the forces appeared roughly balanced, with Japan holding slight numerical superiority. In practice, Japanese advantages in experience training and previous combat success suggested they would win any engagement decisively. But Nimitz had critical advantages. He knew where the Japanese were and when they would attack. His carriers were positioned to ambush the Japanese after they committed to attacking Midway. And he had Midway itself, a stationary aircraft base that could contribute additional aircraft to the battle and serve as a damage sponge absorbing Japanese attacks while American carriers remained hidden. At 0430 hours on June 4, 1942, a PBY Catalina patrol plane from Midway spotted the Japanese carrier force 180 miles northwest of the atoll. The report was transmitted immediately. Many planes heading Midway bearing 320 degrees distance, 150. At 0455, Nagumo's carriers launched their strike against Midway 36 Val dive bombers, 36 Kate torpedo bombers, configured as level bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. The strike group headed southeast toward Midway, while Nagumo's carriers recovered their scout planes and launched combat air patrol fighters. Nagumo held back a reserve strike force. 36 Val dive bombers and 36 Kate torpedo bombers, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships. These aircraft sat on the carrier hangar decks armed and ready, waiting for reports of American carriers. If American ships were spotted, the reserve force would launch immediately and destroy them. At 5520, Midway's radar detected the incoming Japanese strike. Every aircraft on Midway scrambled. Marine fighters climbed to intercept. Army, Navy, and Marine bombers, already loaded and armed, launched and headed toward the Japanese carriers. Within minutes, Midway's skies filled with aircraft. The Japanese strike hit Midway at 0630. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and determined defense by Marine fighters, the Japanese bombers damaged the airfield, destroyed fuel storage tanks, and inflicted casualties on ground personnel. But the runways remained operational. At 0700, the Japanese strike commander, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, radioed Nagumo, "There is need for a second attack." This message created the first critical decision point. Nagumo had to choose between maintaining his reserve strike force armed for anti-ship operations or rearming them for a second attack on Midway. No American carriers had been reported. The Midway defenses remained active. A second strike appeared necessary. At 0715, Nagumo ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed. On the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, ordnance crews began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs and replacing them with high-explosive bombs for land targets. The removed ordnance was stacked temporarily on the hangar decks, aviation fuel hoses connected to aircraft being refueled. The hangar decks became cluttered with ordnance fuel lines and aircraft. Then at 0728, everything changed. A Japanese scout plane from the cruiser Tone transmitted a report. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships in position bearing 010 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees speed over 20 knots. American ships heading toward the Japanese fleet at high speed, possibly carriers. Nagumo's entire tactical situation had just been reversed. He immediately ordered the rearming operation stopped and reversed. The high-explosive bombs just loaded onto aircraft were removed. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs were brought back from storage. The hangar decks descended into chaos as ordnance crews worked frantically to rearm aircraft for the 3rd time that morning. At 0745, Nagumo demanded clarification from the Tone Scout, ascertain ship types, and maintain contact. The scout took nearly 20 minutes to respond, finally reporting at 800 hours the enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The confirmation of an American carrier made the rearming operation urgent, but the operation was slow, complex, and dangerous. Bombs and torpedoes were being moved back and forth across crowded hangar decks while aircraft were being refueled. At 0817, the first American attack arrived. 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and 4 B-26 Marauder bombers from Midway attacked at low altitude. Japanese combat air patrol Zeros and anti-aircraft fire destroyed 5 of the 6 Avengers and 2 of the 4 Marauders. Not a single hit was scored. But the attack forced Nagumo to maneuver his carriers, violently disrupting the rearming operation and keeping his fighters engaged at low altitude. At 0820, the first returning aircraft from the Midway strike began arriving over the fleet low on fuel, some damaged, all needing to land immediately. Nagumo faced another critical decision. He could clear the flight decks and recover the Midway strike, but that would delay launching the reserve strike against the American carrier. Or he could launch the reserve strike first, leaving the Midway strike aircraft circling until the launch was complete, risking that damaged aircraft would crash or run out of fuel. Nagumo chose to recover the Midway strike first. It was a reasonable decision based on the information available. His fighters needed to land and refuel. His returning bombers were low on fuel. The rearming operation for the reserve strike was not yet complete. Better to recover the aircraft already in the air, complete the rearming below decks, then launch a properly armed and coordinated strike against the American carrier. Between 0820 and 0918, Nagumo's carriers recovered the Midway strike aircraft. The 4 carriers turned into the wind, one at a time, landed aircraft, then turned back on course. The operations took nearly an hour. During that time, no aircraft could be launched. The reserve strike sat on the hangar decks, still being rearmed. The rearming operation was nearly complete but not finished. Meanwhile, the American carriers were launching their strikes. The launches were rushed and poorly coordinated. Enterprise launched first beginning at 0700. Her air group consisted of 33 Dauntless dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, 14 Devastator torpedo bombers under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, and 10 Wildcat fighters under Lieutenant James Gray. The squadrons launched separately and failed to rendezvous into a coordinated formation. Hornet launched at 755. Her air group consisted of 35 Dauntless dive bombers under Commander Stanhope Ring, 15 Devastator torpedo bombers under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, and 10 Wildcat fighters. Again, the squadrons became separated shortly after launch. Yorktown launched last at 0838. Her air group consisted of 17 Dauntless dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, 12 Devastator torpedo bombers under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, and 6 Wildcat fighters. This group maintained better coordination but would arrive at the target area later than the others. The American strike groups headed toward the Japanese carriers following courses calculated from the morning scout reports. But those calculations were wrong. The Japanese had changed course multiple times while recovering aircraft and evading Midway-based attacks. When the American strike groups arrived at the expected position, the Japanese carriers were not there. At 0920, Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, spotted the Japanese carriers approximately 30 miles north of the calculated position. Waldron had ignored his air group commander's planned course and followed his instinct about where the Japanese would be. His instinct was correct, but his squadron was alone without fighter escort or dive bomber support. Waldron did not hesitate. He led his 15 Devastators directly at the carriers in a low-level attack. The TBD Devastator was slow and obsolete. Its maximum speed was 115 miles per hour at sea level. The torpedo run required flying straight and level at that speed for several minutes to set up the attack. During that time, the Devastators were vulnerable to every weapon the Japanese could bring to bear. Japanese Zeros swarmed the torpedo bombers. Anti-aircraft fire from carriers and screening ships filled the sky. One after another, the Devastators were shot down. Waldron's aircraft was among the first to fall. A few pilots managed to launch their torpedoes before being hit. All torpedoes missed. Within 7 minutes, all 15 aircraft were destroyed. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the ocean and watching the battle unfold. At 0925, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked. Same result. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led his 14 Devastators against the carriers without fighter escort. Japanese Zeros and anti-aircraft fire destroyed 10 of 14 aircraft. No hits. The survivors turned back toward Enterprise. At 0940, Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked with fighter escort. The 6 Wildcats tried to protect the torpedo bombers but were overwhelmed by Zeros. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey led his 12 Devastators through intense fire. 10 were shot down. 2 survived. No torpedoes hit. In 20 minutes, 3 American torpedo squadrons had been annihilated. 35 of 41 torpedo bombers were destroyed. 77 aircrew were killed. Not a single torpedo had hit a Japanese carrier. The attacks appeared to have accomplished nothing except the sacrifice of brave men and obsolete aircraft. But the torpedo attacks had accomplished something critical, something that would become apparent only when the dive bombers arrived. They had pulled every Japanese combat air patrol fighter down to sea level. Every Zero was at low altitude chasing torpedo bombers, firing at close range, burning fuel. The Japanese carriers were maneuvering violently to avoid torpedoes turning into the wind, steaming away from the wind, making it impossible to launch aircraft. The flight decks were clear of aircraft, but still crowded with fuel hoses and rearming equipment. And the hangar decks below were packed with armed and fueled aircraft along with stacked ordnance that had been removed during the multiple rearming operations. At 1,000 hours, the last torpedo bomber attack ended. Nagumo's carriers had survived 3 separate attacks over 40 minutes. They had suffered no damage. His combat air patrol had performed magnificently, destroying nearly every attacking aircraft. His anti-aircraft gunners had shot down anything that penetrated the fighter screen. The morning's attacks had been beaten off decisively, but Nagumo's carriers were in the worst possible condition to defend against the attack that was coming. The combat air patrol fighters were at sea level low on fuel and ammunition, unable to climb to high altitude quickly. The flight decks were clear but not ready to launch aircraft. Below decks, the hangar spaces were crowded with armed aircraft fuel lines and ordnance. Damage control parties had been at full alert for hours and were exhausted. The carriers were steaming in formation, predictable courses vulnerable. Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour. His fuel was critical. He had perhaps 20 minutes before he would have to turn back or risk ditching in the ocean. His air group commander had calculated the Japanese position based on morning scout reports. That calculation was wrong. McCluskey had flown to the expected position and found nothing. At 0935, McCluskey made the decision that would change the battle. He did not turn back. He analyzed the situation. The Japanese were attacking Midway, so they had to be southwest of his current position. He turned southwest and continued searching. At 0950, he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast at high speed, trailing a white wake. The destroyer was Arashi, rejoining the carrier formation after finishing a depth charge attack on the American submarine Nautilus. McCluskey followed that wake like an arrow pointing at the carriers. At 10:20, he saw them, 4 carriers in a loose box formation, flight decks empty but crowded with equipment, escort vessels, scattered fighters at low altitude. The Japanese fleet was completely vulnerable, and McCluskey had arrived at the perfect moment. McCluskey did not wait for the Yorktown dive bombers, who were somewhere behind him. He did not try to coordinate with fighters who had turned back due to fuel shortages. He recognized the opportunity and seized it. At 10:20, he radioed his squadron commanders, "Attack immediately." McCluskey assigned targets rapidly. He would take Kaga with bombing Squadron 6. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Scouting Squadron 6, would attack Akagi. The squadrons split and rolled into their dives. At exactly 10:22 hours, McCluskey pushed his Dauntless over into a 70-degree dive. The perforated dive brakes deployed with their characteristic scream. Behind him, 36 more Dauntless bombers followed into the dive. The aircraft plummeted toward the carriers at 250 miles per hour, pilots leaning forward against their harnesses, peering through bomb sights as the carrier decks grew larger. Anti-aircraft fire erupted around them. Black puffs from 5-inch guns, tracers from smaller weapons. Some aircraft were hit, shuddering as fragments tore through wings and fuselages. Pilots maintained their dives, counting down altitude: 10,000 feet, 8,000 feet, 6,000 feet, 4,000 feet. On Kaga's bridge, Captain Jisaku Okada watched the American dive bombers with growing horror. There was nothing he could do. His fighters were at sea level, unable to climb to intercept altitude. His flight deck was cluttered with equipment. His ship was steaming straight, unable to maneuver violently enough to throw off the American aim. The dive bombers were already committed, already falling, already too close to stop. At 10:24, the first bomb hit Kaga near the forward elevator. The 1,000-pound weapon penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar where armed and fueled aircraft were parked. The explosion ignited aviation fuel and detonated bombs that had been stacked on the hangar deck during the morning's rearming chaos. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar. Fires spread instantly. A second bomb hit Kaga's flight deck amidships, penetrating into the hangar and adding to the inferno. A third bomb hit aft near the island structure. Within seconds, Kaga was burning from bow to stern. Fuel fires raged on both hangar decks. Ordnance cooked off in the flames, sending shrapnel through the carrier's interior spaces. Crewmen tried to fight the fires, but were driven back by heat and explosions. 3 miles to the east, Akagi came under attack from Lieutenant Richard Best's 3-aircraft section. Best had started his dive, targeting Kaga, but noticed McCluskey's entire squadron already attacking that carrier. He made a split-second decision and shifted his aim to Akagi Nagumo's flagship. Best's 2 wingmen, Ensigns Frederick Weber and Richard Kroger, followed him. At 10:26, Best released his bomb from 2,500 feet. The 1,000-pound weapon fell away cleanly and struck Akagi's flight deck just aft of the amidships elevator. The bomb penetrated the wooden flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar. The explosion was relatively small compared to the devastation on Kaga, but it detonated in the middle of the rearming operation. Akagi's hangar deck was packed with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Aviation fuel torpedoes and bombs were scattered across the deck. The bomb blast ignited fuel fires that spread to the ordnance. Within minutes, Akagi's hangar was an inferno matching Kaga's. Explosions shook the carrier as stored ordnance detonated. Damage control parties fought desperately but could not contain the fires. The flames spread to stored torpedoes, which detonated with devastating force, tearing apart the hangar structure and starting additional fires. At the same moment, Best was attacking Akagi. The Yorktown dive bombers arrived. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie had spotted the Japanese carriers at 10:20, the same time as McCluskey. Leslie's formation was several miles east of Enterprise's aircraft. He could see Enterprise's dive bombers attacking 2 carriers. Leslie assigned his 17 Dauntless bombers to attack Soryu, the carrier that Enterprise's aircraft had not targeted. At 10:25, Leslie's squadron rolled into their dives. Leslie himself had suffered a malfunction that released his bomb prematurely during the approach, so he led the attack without weapons, guiding his squadron, while unable to contribute to the strike. His pilots followed him down, maintaining perfect formation discipline, despite watching their commander fly into anti-aircraft fire without ability to attack. At 10:27, 3 1,000-pound bombs from Leslie's squadron struck Soryu's flight deck in rapid succession. The first hit near the forward elevator, the second hit amidships, the third hit aft. All 3 bombs penetrated into the hangar decks. The same pattern repeated, bombs detonating amid armed and fueled aircraft fuel fires, igniting ordnance secondary explosions, ripping through the carrier's interior. Damage control parties overwhelmed by the speed and intensity of the fires. By 10:28, 6 minutes after McCluskey began his dive, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were burning out of control. Kaga, hit by 4 bombs, was engulfed in fires from bow to stern. Akagi, hit by 1 bomb, was suffering from internal explosions as stored ordnance detonated. Soryu, hit by 3 bombs, was burning as fiercely as the other 2. On all 3 carriers, the fires had spread beyond any possibility of control. Magazines were heating, torpedoes were cooking off, the carriers were dying. The physics of what happened in those 6 minutes is straightforward. A 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb dropped from 14,000 feet reached terminal velocity of approximately 650 feet per second. At that velocity, the bomb possessed enormous kinetic energy. Hitting a wooden flight deck, the bomb punched through like tissue paper, penetrated into the hangar deck below, and detonated. The explosion released approximately 1,000 pounds of TNT equivalent, creating a blast wave and fireball that destroyed everything within several yards. But the bombs themselves did not sink the carriers. What sank the carriers was what the bombs ignited. Each carrier's hangar deck contained approximately 30 to 40 fully armed and fueled aircraft. Each aircraft carried several hundred gallons of aviation gasoline. Each was armed with bombs or torpedoes. Additional ordnance was stacked on the hangar decks from the morning's multiple rearming operations. Fuel lines ran across the decks, connecting to aircraft being refueled. The environment was catastrophically dangerous, and the American bombs transformed it into an inferno. Aviation gasoline ignited instantly when exposed to flame or explosion. The fuel fires spread across the hangar decks at incredible speed, engulfing aircraft ordnance and crewmen. Bombs detonated in the fires, each explosion spreading the flames further and triggering more ordnance. Torpedoes cooked off their warheads containing 500 to 1,000 pounds of explosive. Each torpedo detonation was equivalent to another 1,000-pound bomb going off inside the carrier. Japanese damage control doctrine emphasized aggressive firefighting and rapid repair of damaged systems. Japanese carriers were designed with large hangar spaces, minimal compartmentalization, and wide-open layouts that facilitated aircraft handling. These design choices maximized operational efficiency but created vulnerability. Fires could spread rapidly through open spaces. Explosions in one area affected multiple compartments. The carriers were optimized for offense, not survivability. By contrast, American carriers later in the war would be designed with much greater emphasis on damage control, extensive compartmentalization, automatic fire suppression systems, isolated magazines, protected aviation fuel systems. These features made American carriers heavier and reduced their aircraft capacity, but dramatically improved survivability. But in June 1942, neither side's carriers were designed to survive the kind of damage that American bombs inflicted at Midway. On Akagi's bridge, Vice Admiral Nagumo watched his flagship burn. Fires were spreading throughout the ship. Explosions shook the hull every few seconds. Damage control parties reported that fires were out of control in the hangar decks and spreading to lower spaces. Ammunition magazines were heating. The carrier had to be abandoned. At 10:46, Nagumo transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. He stood on Nagara's deck and watched Akagi burn. Around him, staff officers were stunned. In 20 minutes, 3 fleet carriers had been reduced to burning wrecks. The carrier striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had been considered invincible, was destroyed. But one carrier remained. Hiryu, positioned several miles north of the other 3 carriers, had not been spotted by the American dive bombers. Her flight deck was clear. Her aircraft were ready. At 10:40, Hiryu launched a counter-strike 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters heading toward the reported position of American carriers. The Japanese strike found Yorktown at 1200 and attacked immediately. Despite intense anti-aircraft fire and combat air patrol fighters, 3 bombs hit Yorktown. The carrier was damaged, but still operational, still able to launch and recover aircraft. At 12:45, Hiryu launched a second strike, 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros. This strike found Yorktown at 14:30 and hit her with 2 torpedoes. The carrier lost power and began listing. At 1500, her captain ordered abandon ship, but American scout planes had located Hiryu. At 15:30, Enterprise launched 24 Dauntless dive bombers. At 1700, they found Hiryu and attacked. 4 bombs hit the carrier. The same devastating pattern repeated. Fires swept through the hangar decks. Ordnance detonated. Damage control efforts failed. By 1730, Hiryu was burning out of control. By sunset on June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were dying or dead. Kaga sank at 1925. Soryu sank at 1913. Akagi burned through the night, was scuttled by Japanese destroyers at 0500 on June 5th. Hiryu burned until 0900 on June 5th, then sank. More than 2,500 Japanese sailors died. Over 280 aircraft went down with the carriers or were destroyed when the carriers sank. The strategic consequences were immediate and catastrophic for Japan. The 4 carriers lost at Midway represented the core of Japan's carrier-striking power. Their loss could not be quickly replaced. Japan's shipyards could build replacement carriers, but training replacement aircrew would take years. The experienced pilots and aircrew who died at Midway represented a decade of training and combat experience. After Midway, Japan was on the strategic defensive for the rest of the war. Never again would Japanese carriers operate with the confidence and freedom they had enjoyed from December 1941 to June 1942. The initiative passed permanently to American forces. The outcome of the Pacific War, though 3 more years of fighting remained, was decided in those 6 minutes on June 4, 1942. But those 6 minutes were not predetermined. They resulted from a series of decisions, sacrifices, and coincidences that brought American dive bombers to the right place at the right time. Yamamoto's decision to attack Midway created the opportunity. Nimitz's decision to ambush the Japanese with every available carrier provided the forces. The torpedo bomber attacks, though they failed tactically and cost 77 aircrew their lives, pulled Japanese fighters down to sea level and created the vulnerability the dive bombers exploited. McCluskey's decision to keep searching when his fuel was critical led him to the Japanese carriers. His decision to follow the destroyer Arashi's wake brought him to the exact location. His decision to attack immediately without waiting for coordination meant the attack hit during the 6-minute window when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. Change any of those decisions, and the result changes. If McCluskey had turned back when his fuel reached critical levels, he would not have found the carriers. If he had waited to coordinate with Yorktown's dive bombers, the attack would have come 5 or 10 minutes later, possibly after Japanese fighters had climbed back to altitude. If the torpedo bombers had not attacked, first Japanese fighters would have been at high altitude ready to intercept the dive bombers. If Nagumo had launched his reserve strike before recovering the Midway strike aircraft, his hangar decks would not have been packed with armed and fueled aircraft when the bombs hit. The 6 minutes at Midway were the culmination of everything that had happened before, and they determined everything that would happen after. Those 6 minutes were built on intelligence that broke Japanese codes, on tactics developed over years of peacetime training, on the courage of torpedo bomber crews who pressed their attacks knowing they would probably die, on the skill of dive bomber pilots who had practiced their craft until they could put bombs on carrier decks from 14,000 feet, on admirals who made correct decisions under pressure, on sailors who did their duty despite overwhelming odds. Wade McCluskey received the Navy Cross for his leadership at Midway. He later retired as a Rear Admiral. Richard Best received the Navy Cross but was medically retired in 1944 due to tuberculosis contracted when he inhaled caustic soda fumes from a faulty oxygen system during the Midway battle. Maxwell Leslie received the Navy Cross and continued flying combat missions until 1943. John Waldron, commander of Torpedo Squadron 8, received the Navy Cross posthumously for leading the attack that pulled Japanese fighters down to sea level and created the opportunity for the dive bombers. The Battle of Midway is remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War, and that assessment is correct. But the turning point was not the entire battle or even the entire day. The turning point was 6 minutes from 10:22 to 10:28 hours on June 4, 1942, when American dive bombers caught 4 Japanese carriers with their flight decks crowded their fighters at sea level and their hangar decks packed with armed and fueled aircraft. In those 6 minutes, the strategic balance of the Pacific War shifted permanently. Japan would never again have the offensive capability it possessed before Midway. America would never again face the possibility of defeat in the Pacific. The war would continue for 3 more years, but its outcome was decided in those 6 minutes when 54 American dive bombers found the target they were seeking and executed their attack with devastating precision. History is often decided in moments, not years. Battles are decided in minutes, not days. The Pacific War was decided in 6 minutes at Midway, when everything came together perfectly for American forces and catastrophically for Japan. Those 6 minutes changed the war. They changed the Pacific. And they demonstrated that in warfare, as in life, timing is everything. Being in the right place at the right time, with the right weapons and the right training and the right plan, can accomplish in 6 minutes what years of fighting might not achieve.